So the evolution, and there is a kind of an evolution, there's a collective evolution. And I think that we're in the midst of a collective evolution where there was, a certain recognition and a certain brilliance and a certain recognition of the unfolding of enlightenment, of self-realization, of, coming to your divineness, the natural state. And the increase, and whatever you want to call it, I know when James called it the compassionate intelligence, I thought that's it. You can say it's the light coming into, the earth. You can sense that, you can see that. I have a beautiful little healer woman, and she calls it the magnetic energy that's coming and it's blowing all the circuits. And, there's different ways of sort of talking about what's happening. But I like the compassionate intelligence because it knows exactly what is going on and how to bring this evolution to fruition. Exactly. The depth of wisdom, the depth of the intelligence, the depth of the unconditionality brings you to your knees when you just start to see the scope of it, what's actually taking place on the planet. And, you can be overwhelmed by it. I've been talking to some young people in the last few years, and there's a lot of despair because they're the ones who are going to walk through it. Sorry about that, McCall. But at the same time, the openness to the totality, the one, the great being, has never been more vivid. And the ones coming in have never been more available and able to come into their nature. And then, like I was saying the other day, they aren't trying to then go to their cave or hide out or, have a group that they are safe with and can only talk about what they want to talk about. They want to head out into the world. They want to be engaged. And so it is the depth of your nature, which is unknowable and never ends and constantly is unfolding and revealing itself and never, never, ever, ever lands anywhere. It never arrives. And yet at the same time, the humanness, the form, is being filled up and imbued. I think perhaps like collectively has not taken place before. So the expression, I read one time it was called God, our bodies are called God's hand. Isn't that kind of cool? So it's the one who does the work, right? And that gap is closing. It was never actually there, but collectively we're now understanding, what is probably the most famous sutra of at least the Buddhist traditions, which is the Heart Sutra, right? Emptiness into form, form into emptiness, one. Jesus probably spoke of it maybe a little bit more clearly in our language. One. I and my Father are one. So the disappearance or the absorption of the sense of the identity of me or the ego on its own, unfolds and dissolves. For most of us, and I'll speak for myself, I had read, what's her name? Bernadette Roberts. And she's the only one I think that was writing about it at the time. And hers was a really, really rough transition. Because she had a very strong, she was a Catholic in the Catholic faith, and very deep meditator into silence. And just one day she got up out of her pew in the church that she was attending, and the silence remained. And as she began to describe what she called the unfolding of the no self, she had to let go of her personal God. And it was very, very challenging and difficult for her. Very difficult. For some of us, that's not a strong conditioning or belief. The personal God seemed to be the life essence that woke up within the body-mind structure. We found it in ourselves. But for her, that wasn't true. And so it was very, very challenging. So what I'm trying to say is I had no understanding or context at all for this unfolding of the no self. I mean, I'd heard about thy will, and I'd heard about, especially the Christian mystics. Tonight I'll bring the book that I forgot to bring this morning. And it was a beautiful description in the Christian mystics that talked about when the change of occupancy, when God became fully unbound in the physicality. And it's no longer a person becoming God-filled or a person, becoming enlightened. It's like now the essence or the root presence, the God, whatever you want to call it, the Holy Spirit, that then just wakes up and begins to be now conscious. It's prominent in one's life. It's conscious now. And for some of you, many of you who have been going through that, it's not an easy unfolding. I know here I had very little fear of, the dark, of, all sorts of things that just happened. I didn't have I had beautiful guidance. But if you've noticed, you can have all the gorgeous and precise guidance in the world, but until it becomes your experience, it doesn't quite go in, right? And so when this unfolding started to happen here, where the absorption really is, I think, a more accurate description, all I noticed was the self-referencing was falling away. And what I mean by the self-referencing is it's my life, my understanding, my ego, my awakening, all of that just, and it had been going in and out for years when that essential shift happened. But it still prevailed. It was still there. And I just noticed that it just started to happen less and less and less. And so, there was then this curiosity. But what I'm trying to get across it wasn't like I went, okay, now I'm going to go for the no self. I had no understanding of what that was. No, other than a, conceptual kind of what I'd read about, but I didn't quite get it. And it didn't sound all that appealing, frankly. I like my life, I kind of a sensuous person. All that austerities and no self didn't seem very appealing. But it happened anyway. And so when it unfolds, it often will go, and different people have different ways of going through it, but it will have different phases. And, some of it is like really wonderful because the ego stops being an overriding influence, really, pretty much. I mean, it still can raise its head, but pretty much it doesn't interfere much. There's just this sense of what you are. And what you are is, Khenpo Jigme was talking about, it's happiness, it's a sense of joy, it's a sense of well-being. It's a sense of, all is well, even though maybe everything around you is crazy. Something is just perfectly all is well. So that was a part of the unfolding, as of whatever you want to call the no self. And I know I've spoke of this frequently, but what was very challenging was my most precious identity. And that just took a while. Like we were saying last night, it's like a knitted sweater, and you just keep pulling it, and it unwinds and it unwinds and unwinds. And sometimes the unwinding will take longer than what you would like. And then I just woke up one morning and all of that was gone. And in the place of that identity was a greater sense of ease and joy and well-being. Often, the phase of these unfolding of the change of occupancy when God becomes prominent within the life. And all these, groovy things that you really liked about yourself, they still survived. Some of them, some of them don't. It's that sense of, I don't know even how to describe it. It's like a different movement starts to happen within the unfolding of your life. And part of that unfolding, and it's moment by moment, it's like you just step into the current, and the current takes you, and the current reveals itself, and the current is always available, and it's just moment by moment by moment. And one morning you may wake up and you're in what I call the dead zone. Do you know what I'm talking about? Nothing means anything. Some of you go through it, some of you don't. I don't know the difference. But here it was fairly, not constant, but I would say maybe 4 times where it was really quite prevalent in the life. The first time totally freaked me out. The second time I kind of got a sense of a little bit of what was happening. The third time I just wrote it out, knowing that it was just unhooking from all of the personal overlays, the personal roles. And the personal roles could be you as a mother. The personal roles could be with you with your soulmate. The personal roles can be with you as a teacher. The personal roles can be with you as a successful person in your business. And all of a sudden, my friend Jennifer calls it the bone and ash period. And that's what it feels like. It's just flat. And a lot of people get stuck there. I know when I first started to go to Boulder to teach, and I would run into 2 or 3, well, more than that, people who had got stuck into that. And they grabbed it and freaked out about it and talked about it constantly. And we're talking 20 years or so. Don't do that. That's not what it's asking. There was a grabbing it, an intellectual, conceptual grabbing it. I remember talking to this one man, he was so genuine, and he had freaked out about the intellectual understanding of the ego dying. He called it the edge of death. I said, well, and so I was trying to talk about it a little bit, and at least my experience with that. And I said, how long has this been going on? And he said, 25 years. This is not necessary. But in all likelihood, you will run into something a little bit like that. But if you understand what's really happening, then it's much easier. You just realize it's the roles, the ego structure, and the roles that you're unhooking. And that's, parental cultural, familia, your family influences. It also can be a certain ideal or idea about yourself. Some people, they'll just say, well, I'm extremely sensitive. This is good and bad. And I can't take loud noises or people or groups or parties or restaurants you see what I'm saying? It's an identity. It doesn't mean that you don't have a nervous system that may be quite sensitive. But, I used to read about the awakened beings that lived in New York City, right? Or lived in India. And I have experienced that myself, where there's just this open awareness, and sounds just arise and fall and arise and fall, and people yell or whatever happens, and it doesn't impact anything because there's nothing in there going ooh woo, right? It doesn't happen. There's no contraction. It just arises and it dissolves. It's like a transmutation, actually. Now, you may have your preference. And obviously, if you live here, you like no traffic and quiet. There's only one restaurant, but it's okay. You go to Salida or Taos, Santa Fe. So this absorption, if there's not a kind of a guidance, I think it's a very difficult phase to go through, because literally everything is being given up. There's no one in there controlling it anymore. There's no one in there that's holding on to your roles. There's no one in there that's holding on to your spiritual idealism. There's no one in there that is, it's just blank. It's just blank. But when it unfolds, and usually there's a series of unfoldings that happen, but when it unfolds each time, and for some it's a day or two, for some it's a month or two. If you're heading into it over 3 or 4 months, you might want to see if you aren't hanging on to it, right? Who knows about that? But ask questions. Have you frozen around it, conceptualized around it? Is love now fills that space that has been emptied of the separate sense of the ego. And now the capability of holding and being and a loving presence. It wasn't like you did anything. It's just that those cells, that space that was occupied with roles and idealisms and fears and whatever, is gone. And then love, because that's what we're made up of, fills that space. And now you're a much more capable being of being a loving, truly loving human on the planet. It still feels a little weird. I mean, it does. You'll be walking along your living room floor and you go, I have no idea who's walking. It's kind of strange. But you just say, it's a little weird, and you go on. It's no big deal. And all, especially in the Asian, I would say more the Japanese, their beautiful poetry and stories, and they would say, there's just eating, there's just walking, there's just drinking, there's just talking. And that's what they're pointing to. It isn't like this frozen, mindful interpretation that a lot of traditions, especially, I don't know, Hinayana, if you want to call it that type approach. I just took one look at that and I went, no, thank you. This is not my path. It's very dry, kind of controlling. But what is meant by there's just walking, there's just drinking, there's just there's no intermediate. There isn't like a ego that was lost in the conditioning, and there's no longer the spiritual ego. And let me tell you, spiritual egos are pretty big because it's given you what you've wanted so far. And I don't know almost anyone I've ever met that doesn't get landed in the spiritual ego, at least for a little while. Just part of it. And that's where we see, oh my God, they're awake. For, save me, man. I don't want to do that one. It's really prevalent around here, because people are always checking each other out. Are you awake? Just get used to it. I say, if you could teach in Crestone or Boulder, you can teach anywhere. Because there's a lot of awake people. So it just takes you. I can't say it in any other way. It isn't like you've signed up for it. No one signs up to disappear. They sign up to be better people, to quit suffering, and because there's no other choice, that essence of life is moving through you. It's going to take you. It's going to take over. And you can fight it for the next 20 or 50 years, or you can just, I love how, Jingmei just kept going. Because that's it. You don't do it by thinking about it. You don't do it by, all these extravagant things you're going to do to wake up, That isn't it. I mean, it can get you to the doorway, but it's that open, allowing, being spacious, unbound, undefended presence. And that doesn't mean that you end up being a doormat or living with people who don't treat you well, or it doesn't mean that at all. In fact, you really find it's not a boundary. And boundaries can be helpful at a certain point. It's like this doesn't work here. It's simple. You're not wrong. It just doesn't work here. And we can either talk it out and try to come to something that maybe works for both of us, or it's like a magnet. You're drawn to it or you're repelled. But there isn't any decision about that's a good person and that's a bad person. It's just it's drawn to or it draws out. And if there's conflict, you're drawn to, then maybe diving into the conflict, because it's always, always, always your reaction. And that doesn't mean, that a person can be mean to you or yell at you or, throw little fits or control or hold themselves back because they can't do anything about it. That doesn't mean that you just hang with that. It just means that you take back that felt unloved or felt repelled or felt, whatever you're experiencing. Take it to the love ground. It's infinite. So actually, I think you find yourself, you stand taller, you have a sense of well-being and goodness and worthiness. Because all that other is just, like Jonathan was, reading last night, they're just the covering or the protection of the dragon, the scales. They just fall away. And the more you just stand free and true and whole and undefined in a certain kind of way, the more, I don't know, I guess the word is freedom. You just start to live in freedom. And not some, US idea of freedom, but freedom from opinions, freedom from, whatever anyone can kind of lay on you.